Okay, welcome. This is a session on navigating structures of power and legitimacy in a rapidly changing Arctic. We have two of the presenters here in person and two online joining us from the DC area, from George Mason University. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce the four speakers, and then each of them are gonna speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll just have a conversation. But I was telling them that I'm excited about this session because I'm Lauren Risi. I work at the Wilson Center in DC with the Environmental Change and Security Program. The Wilson Center also has a Polar Institute, and we end up working very closely with them often because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic and has significant implications for what is being experienced around the world globally, and then also the sort of the types of innovation and research and thinking that's being done in the context of the Arctic can be really important for informing efforts elsewhere. So we're going to hear first from Haydee Dijkstal, who is a barrister practicing international criminal law and international human rights law and general crime. She is also a U.S. attorney with over a decade of experience practicing in international law. She's the head of international law at 33 Bedford Row Chambers. Next, we'll hear from Anne-Charlotte Lagrandcourt. I'm sorry, you say your name so much better. Who serves as a UN advocacy officer for the Indigenous Peoples Center for Documentation, Research, and Information, DOCIP. It's a Swiss NGO supporting Indigenous rights at the UN and before EU institutions. She has a background and experience in international criminal law and human rights, and is a qualified New York State attorney as well. Online, joining us from George Mason, we have Dr. Sara Cobb, who is a longtime leader in the fields of negotiation and conflict resolution studies, and professor emerita at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, where she was also the director for 8 years. She teaches and conducts research on the relationship between narrative and violent conflict. She's also the director of the Center for the Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution at the Carter School that provides a hub for scholarship on narrative approaches to conflict analysis and resolution. And finally, Kristin Weis is an interdisciplinary social scientist and doctoral candidate at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Her research centers on rapid changes in the Arctic and explores the intricate relationship between tourism, sense of place, and conflicts. And of course, all of these women have much longer bios that they can share in the context of their presentations as well. I was not able to do them justice. Haydee, I'm going to turn first to you. Put it away.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining this event. As you've heard, our entire panel is discussing the situation in the Arctic, but we're doing so from a number of different perspectives and vantage points and different disciplines as well. So to start, you're going to hear from Anne-Charlotte and I, who have teamed up together to put this presentation together, and we bring the perspective of the law, and in particular international human rights law. And even between the two of us, we have different experiences, but which are also complementary as well. So I'm more of a practitioner, and I represent victims of human rights violations in order to ensure that their rights are either protected, or if they have been violated, that there is justice and accountability for what they've experienced and what they've the harm that they've suffered. And Anne-Charlotte has a particular expertise in legal advocacy for Indigenous peoples, but I'll let her provide a little bit more detail when she speaks in a moment. So what I should say is that what we're presenting today is very much a work in progress. We are presenting our initial research and analysis, and we are hoping to put together a paper that we will hopefully be sharing quite soon. So let me just start by setting the scene a little bit about what I think we're all going to be discussing. So in March of 2022, a month after Russia's invasion onto Ukrainian territory, 7 of the 8 members of the Arctic Council, so this includes Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. Those 7 members condemned the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by fellow Arctic Council member Russia. And the 7 members announced a pause in their participation in the work of the Council and its subsidiary bodies due to these developments. So very much a pause in the work that the Council is doing overall. So this pause in the work has meant that the ongoing issues, which the Arctic Council ordinarily would attend to, have been left unaddressed and without engagement and support of the Council. And this includes issues of climate change, globalization, development projects, and natural resource extraction, which directly affect the rights of local and Indigenous communities under international human rights law and environmental law. And this is very much what our presentation is focusing on, the rights of Indigenous people. So I think it's important to emphasize and draw out the wider significance of this development. Some of the key words and phrases that we looked at when setting up this panel are things like power structure and legitimacy and conflict. But I think to add a few that really are the foundation of what's happening here is unintended consequences and unexpected impacts as well. So the unintended consequences in regions that were very far from the front line in Ukraine, and the unexpected impacts on individuals and communities that would ordinarily not have an obvious or perceivable connection to the conflict in Ukraine as well. So when Russia invaded the territory of Ukraine in February 2022, it might not have been immediately clear that the consequences of the conflict would extend to the Arctic, impacting local communities for the reasons I said before, the matters like climate change, Indigenous people's rights, and international cooperation. So, as I've said, we're approaching this from international human rights law and that perspective, and really looking at what protections under international human rights law have been missed or are not being provided to local communities because of the pause in the Arctic Council's work. So what our paper is going to aim to do is to first start by recognizing what fundamental rights have been impacted, how they've been impacted, and so to go through those. And it's going to be an analysis of human rights law and what each right the meaning of each right and how it should be fully implemented for local communities and how it's not being done. So, but then to conclude by looking at then also the state's obligations under international human rights law. So there's protections for individuals, but then the obligations of the states to ensure and guarantee those rights. So what I'd like to do first is I'm going to go through a few of those really fundamental rights and set out what should be, how they should be fully and meaningfully implemented and how this pause is impacting them. And Charlotte will do the same with a few of the other fundamental rights. And then we'll speak a little bit about state obligations as well. So the two rights that I want to speak about are the right of access to cultural heritage and the right to development under international rights law. So starting with the right to cultural heritage. This is a human right that's in many of the key human rights documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, and it sets out the guarantee of the right to participate in the cultural life of a community and the right to enjoy one's own culture. It's therefore also an obligation of states that sign on to these international instruments to ensure that right, regardless of and also in light of what's happening politically, regionally, globally, and make sure that these rights of individuals and communities to take part in their culture is fully recognized. And this is part of the work that the Arctic Council did to facilitate dialogue between Indigenous communities and states, and to recognize Indigenous communities as key stakeholders, and so that they could have a voice and could communicate for themselves their own priorities and express concerns or thoughts or contributions to what was happening regionally in the Arctic. So when looking at the right to culture within the context of the situation of Indigenous people in the Arctic, who have lost the ability to act as these key stakeholders on issues of development, climate change, and other matters impacting land and livelihood and culture, it's important to also understand the interconnectivity between culture, the environment, and land, and that is recognized, that interconnectivity is recognized in international law and in international case law as well. International instruments which set out the right to take part in cultural life also mandate that states take steps to achieve the full realization of this right, including measures to preserve culture. And addressing this link, I suppose in reverse, one example would be the Convention on Civil Liberties for damages resulting from activities dangerous to the environment, and it defines environment as including property which forms part of cultural heritage. So importantly, commentary from places like the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights squarely acknowledge the link between cultural and ancestral land and the risks that globalization possesses to the effective and genuine realization of this right. Other international human rights mechanisms, so maybe not the instruments that set out the rights, but the mechanisms which apply those rights and adjudicate whether those rights are being fully realized and ensured and protected by states, such as the Inter-American Human Rights System, have acknowledged this interplay as well in interpreting rights that are set out in the American Convention of Human Rights, such as saying that the right to property is recognized is singularly important as a fundamental basis for the development of indigenous communities, cultural, spiritual, life integrity, and economic survival. And also recognizing that the collective right to survival of an organized people with control, it involves the control over their habitat, and that this is a necessary condition for the reproduction of their culture. So really what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how there is a right to culture, but it's so connected to the land, and it's so connected to an environment for individuals and communities that look to these rights in order to protect their way of life, their identity, their history, their culture. So that's one thing that we're looking at, and we're particularly looking at this gap now because of the pause of the work of the Arctic Council and the fact that Indigenous communities can't have that position of being a stakeholder to voice their concerns over anything that's happening that impacts their right to culture. It's so interconnected, and I think this will be a theme between what we are saying, that so many of these rights are just so interconnected that one leads to another, and it seems like some overlap, but it's just because they're so interconnected and layered on top of each other. I'm mindful of the time, so let me just move to the second right that I wanted to highlight and then pass it over to Charlotte. The second right is the right to development. So the right to development is linked strongly to other rights as well, like the right to self-determination, which Charlotte will be discussing as well. And it's enumerated in foundational treaty bodies, many of the very fundamental human rights documents. And we've also seen a lot of developments with the way that the right to development is interpreted through litigation in these regional courts that adjudicate human rights. And so what the right to development sets out is that all people should have the right to their economic, social, and cultural development, which documents links to the right to freely determine their political status. So what's important is that litigation on this right has resulted in findings that states have an affirmative duty to ensure that individuals and communities can exercise the right to development. And this means that the state is not only obligated to protect the right of individuals and communities to development, but it actually bears the burden of creating conditions favorable to a people's development. It's the state's primary responsibility to assist with the realization of this right. And this duty is where the obligation to consultations of local communities, which again is interconnected, and you'll hear more about, consultations with local communities where it stems from. So what regional human rights courts have found is that the right to development is closely aligned to the issue of participation, and individuals and communities have the right to participate in and contribute to their development, and that they should be active participants and beneficiaries of the right to development. And therefore this duty is on states, and means that in order to create favorable conditions, as was the words used, for development, and to assist with communities' realizations of this right through participation in decisions which are going to affect them, there is a duty to conduct good faith consultations. And regional human rights bodies have interpreted this to mean that states must provide information to communities about decisions or actions that might affect these rights, and must be in constant communication with these parties, something that is not happening anymore with the pause at the council. It's not for the communities to bear the burden of finding a way for their voice, to voice their concerns, their choices, their decisions in the midst of powerful actors. It is the state's obligation under these rights and the way they've been interpreted by these human rights bodies. It's their obligation, the state's obligation, to ensure that these communities are included as active participants in the conversations and decisions that will most affect them. And for states to create such environment, if they don't do so, it would be a breach of these communities' right to development. So that brings us again back to the council, and what is the council doing now that there is a pause in order to facilitate the same level of discourse, participation, inclusion of Indigenous communities, and things like climate change, development, globalization projects that are surely continuing, even though the council's work is not doing so. So let me pause there and pass it to Charlotte. I don't know if you wanted to say anything before, and she'll continue that discussion.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I will continue with discussing the following rights: the right to self-determination, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and the last one being the right to land. As you mentioned, Haydee, the pause in the Arctic Council has had a huge impact on these rights. Well, I would say for Indigenous peoples globally, but also for those in the Arctic region. And so I will also follow up with a question to the audience. Do you know if there is a universal definition of Indigenous peoples? You know that as a legal subject? No? Okay, well, it's a no, you don't know, or no, there is not. What? Sorry.
No, there's not.
There's not. There's not, exactly. Yeah. So there is no universal definition for sure. But there was a Martinez-Cobo study that offered actually a working definition with different factors to be upheld. The most important one being the right to self-identification and determination. And actually, that right has been defined, as Haydee mentioned earlier, in different, not about this one, but about other rights in different international instruments. So one of them being the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, shortened as UNDRIP, but also, for example, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And these right actually really allows Indigenous people to freely determine their political status, but also freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. It's also a right to autonomy and self-government in matters really relating to their local and internal affairs, but that doesn't mean necessarily independence. So we've had examples of Indigenous peoples, not in that region specifically, but in other regions of the world that were not trying to challenge the state sovereignty, for example. So yeah, it's different from, I mean, it's not always a challenge for the state sovereignty or a call for independence. Yes, and so as applied, as applied to the case study, within the Arctic region, especially in the Russian Federation, the current Russian constitution actually confers to, and I quote unquote, indigenous small number people's rights that are, and they are defined only as a group of 50,000 members and below, perpetuating some aspects of their traditional ways of life. But in practice, Russia just negates, their very existence and their rights on a constant basis. And also we've noticed a rise of intimidations within, at the UN, basically. Constant threats, intimidation, and it's on the rise since the start of the war. And I have to move on, also being mindful of the time, but actually, as I mentioned also earlier, all these rights are interlinked, and so that leads me to speak of the right to free, prior, and informed consent. which again is grounded in other rights, such as the right to self-determination, but also the right to be free from racial discrimination, rights that are guaranteed by the international instruments such as the ICCPR or the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or the Third Convention, also enshrined in the UN DRIP again. And really, I mean, if we take the legal terms, one by one, what do they imply? What does that right implies? Well, first, to be free from coercion or intimidation or manipulation, but also prior would imply that consent would be sought sufficiently in advance, for to have an enlightened decision on an activity or a process. And the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, actually in one of its case, used the term early stage or early notice to define prior. Informed will also imply that the information provided would be covering a range of different aspects of the of an activity or project. And again, as applied to the Arctic region and the Russian indigenous peoples from Russia case, there have been so many issues and deprivation of rights in the participation of the indigenous peoples, or I would say participation and consultation on their own development of their own land. I'm sorry, that was clear. All right. Yeah, and so that adds up to to the, or that actually can be tied to the environmental issues in a more general way, and how gas and oil project pipelines also these projects are violating the rights of indigenous peoples and their specific right to free, prior, and informed consent. Which leads me to the last right, the right to land. Again, a right that is enshrined in different legal instruments, such as the ILO Convention 169, the UN DRIP, but also, the CEDAW General Recommendation 39 on the rights of Indigenous women and girls, who should not be forgotten either. And again, as applied to the case at hand, the impact of the invasion of Ukraine and the war are again weighing heavily on indigenous peoples because of an increase in land exploitation and raw materials being mined really on the lands of indigenous peoples in the Russian Arctic region. And so maybe we can conclude with the recommendations. So I would say they can be applied to the region, but they can also be, they can apply to indigenous peoples in a more general way. That's the recommendation they've been making at the UN especially, and they keep making, addressing either the Russian Federation or the UN bodies, organ, or mechanisms. The first one being to effectively implement consultation and respect the FPIC as to environmental projects. And we can again, broaden the topics, but yeah. The second one being enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples, and especially in the decisions that will concern them in their own development. So, but that could be a participation that's legal, social, political, cultural, environmental. And the last one, but not the least, really put a full stop to the threats and intimidations of environmental human rights defender, because that's a very big issue as well. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna switch gears to our online participants now. Let's see if you give me a second. I think Sara, you're up first, so I'm gonna share the screen. Do you want us to look over here? If I'm trying to go to the sides a little bit. Yeah.
That's not the first slide.
Go. I don't know how to go this way. Let's see.
Other way. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This is a fabulously interesting panel because the context that was just provided about the pause in the functioning of the Arctic Council really helps, I think, accent the sort of the implications for rather global processes like the Arctic Council and its and the impact of the Ukraine war on the Arctic, as well as what I think Kristin and I are going to do is sort of zoom in on local communities and their perspective. So it's less about, you know, the institutional frameworks that are operating and how they might be different or impacted by the war, and more about, you know, how folks are living and what are the issues. So this is a work that we did, Kristin and I, on to develop a methodology for basically conflict risk assessment in the High North, tracking dominant discourses. Can I have the next slide? It's part of the NSF-funded research project called Navigating the New Arctic that Kristin and I have been involved with for, I think, the last 4 years, almost 5 years, that is basically integrating the natural environment with a study of the built systems and then looking at the social dynamics integrating those other two dimensions. All of that predicated on the concern that the climate change in the High North is going to have, you know, lots of implications, like, for instance, increased shipping, but also, you know, perhaps increasing tourism and basically challenges and struggles for decision-making in the High North. Can I have the next slide? And, you know, that's basically what I was just saying, but all of these changes in the High North really have potential to increase conflict and have that anchored. We're seeing that as anchored by the dominant discourses that are operating in the communities themselves. But they're also downloaded by local communities from more global contexts as well. And these master narratives are basically limiting decision-making, we would argue, in the face of challenges posed by climate change. Can I have the next slide? So what we want to do is try to understand how to assess the risk of conflict. And we just want to do a quick spin on the earlier models for conflict assessment have been early warning systems, which have basically been kind of factor analysis of sorts, very top down. And the goal was sort of a liberal peace goal, which was to develop, to increase development and reduce state failure, basically driven by US and Western countries' interest in peace, right? And basically disconnected from what we call early response, which is folks on the ground being able to work through their differences and supporting that. As opposed to the more current models of early warning, conflict early warning, which are drawn on both narrative and other social dynamic indications, but we're looking at more specifically at narrative. They're accenting the bottom-up nature of the problems and the data that needs to be collected. And the goal is not sort of conflict resolution, but more about supporting resilience and adaptation. It's more an evolutionary model rather than a fixed model of resolving the conflicts. It's directly connected to community engagement, and the indicators are all local. It's also that the assessment itself is a process of, you know, talking to people about what they are concerned about and what bothers them and why. Just those conversations can end up opening up new opportunities for folks to think differently or to connect differently with each other. So it can also be assessment framed as intervention. Can I have the next slide? So we're really building off of Bourdieu's notion of habitus here, which is you get these habitus as an infrastructure, basically, of meaning that then is foundational to action. So you see master narratives in operation, and they are always in opposition to some alternative narrative, right? Feeding themselves off the differences they make from some other narrative. And all of that downloaded by folks who are making sense of their own lives in those contexts. So, you know, it's important to get interview data across multi-stakeholder perspectives, and we did this in the effort to collect some stories about resilience and conflict. And the next slide. Now, this panel is interested in power and legitimacy, right? And you can't, for us in conflict resolution, can't really think about that without thinking about the structural violence in general, which is a term, a framework developed by Galtung in the late 60s that helped us see that the direct violence we might be looking at, open conflict and physical conflict even, but open and threatening conflict, is really the tip of the iceberg. And what's underneath that is the violence that is inculcated in the culture and in the community through institutions and practices which marginalize folks. And he talked about that in terms of structural violence. And there's also lateral violence as a result of that, which is the way in which folks living in a community, in a space, are conflicting with each other. And these would be marginalized peoples themselves who have conflict with each other as a function of the kinds of hierarchies and marginalization practices that were instituted in, for instance, through colonialism. So just to have this as background for thinking about power and legitimacy in the communities that this research is drawn from. Can I have the next slide? So we had some complexities in terms of data collection. We had COVID, right? And the high north was the communities were really shut off from any kind of in-person data collection because of the because of COVID. We had the circumstances are very weak and non-existent internet connections, right? We also had NSF limitations on paid partnerships, where we could pay local partners to do the interviews for us. We couldn't do that. We didn't have the funding for it and couldn't transfer the funding, and also our own limitations in terms of our cultural knowledge and our local collections, our local connections. So I just want to be transparent about that in terms of the data collection. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so this narrative lens used for conflict assessment, we're just a little couple of sentences on little thoughts on narrative itself. They are think of it as a living structure. It's got its roots, right? And those roots are sort of its mythic foundation of values and traditions of sense making that then are themselves, master narratives, which then are manifest through policies and practices that would be the branches and leaves of that structure. So you can't think about countering a master narrative because, as we often talk about it, some people talk about it, because these things are living, breathing phenomena that are really central to people's lives. Can I have the next slide? And we thought to take up Solon Simmons' model for looking at root narratives as master narratives, right? And he basically has argued in a book called Root Narrative Theory, very interesting, that there are 4 basic ones in our modern time. And whether or not he has it right is not the issue. We're just using this to see what happens. We use this to overlay it on the data and see what we got. The first one is really exemplified by Thomas Hobbes, and it's really a story about the need for the security of the state against the Leviathan and the incoming hordes, right? So we might see current U.S. narratives, anti-immigration narratives as a classic example of that. Then you have John Locke as exemplary, and these are narratives about the importance of personal liberties for the individual, and supporting personal property, the rights of personal property. The next big root narrative is exemplified by Karl Marx, and it's really stories about the importance of equality for people and egalitarianism. That equality is really central. And the last by Frantz Fanon, having to do with the dignity of people and why it's centrally important to care, to attend to identity issues and to the importance of respect and regard for their traditions and their way of life. So can I have the next slide? So this is Solon Simmons' work, and this is sort of another slide that sort of elaborates this, looking at these kinds of narratives that appear in these traditions. And he's called the security narratives, basically the securitarian narrative, root narrative. And the project is really about protecting the state, you know, defense and stability and unity. The second one is the libertarian narrative, which is, you know, the project is really about consent and the consent of the individual and personal merit and, you know, property. And the third, having to do with the egalitarian narrative, is a project around, you know, accountability and largely reciprocity, and equality. And the last is the dignitarian narrative, which is really about inclusion and recognition centrally. So these 4 root narratives have their own project, let's say, and we can see how they're rolled out, the way they live in these communities that we looked at. Can I have the next slide? What we found in the interviews we had is the dominant presence of a dignitarian narrative, as we might have anticipated. These are indigenous peoples deserve to be respected, etc. And they contrast that to colonialism and historical trauma, right? That they have traditional knowledge that they have is central to their own adaptation, that the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation is a, you know, for-profit private institution that is disseminating value to indigenous peoples through the oil industry and the profit from that, that it's wrong. These dignitarians would argue it's wrong to support the drilling. It's wrong to do that in the Alaska National Reserve, Wildlife Reserve. So also that the fossil fuel industry itself is damaging the environment, that it's eroding traditional ways of life, and that it's really important for kids to learn how to speak their native language. So these were the kinds of stories that appeared and that were central to the environment with the communities we talked to. Can I have the next slide? Opposed to that, in opposition to the egalitarian root narrative, where, you know, people have a right to the land and the right to the resources for that land. And they need to be at the table for the negotiation to ensure those rights are protected. They want to engage in self-governance and decision-making. While it's important to preserve indigenous traditions, it's important to remain identity. And you do that through being able to be at the table and being able to have your voice heard and being able to negotiate your power and privilege and position. Can I have the next slide? So this is a depiction of what some of the loops we found in terms of the nature of the conflict and how it was, let's say, structured from a narrative perspective and in opposition to resilience. So people argued, or people told stories about whaling and the importance of indigenous culture and their practices and their history, traditional knowledge. That was all tied to their description of their social services and the way in which their communities were knit together and people were connected. And that was also anchored in faith-based institutions and their faith-based practices. And all of that, they argued, supported their resilience, their ability to adapt, to make decisions, and to you know, largely maintain their identity. Then that was in opposition to, or like let's say, it was in relief, set in relief against these more conflictual stories, which were really about the centrality of oil and its maintenance of the sort of colonial practices of political hierarchy and historical trauma, generating lateral violence and community fissures. So these were the 2 big storylines that were in there. We're a resilient people because of these things, or we have this conflict because of these things. So it was very interesting to see the importance of the dignitarian and the egalitarian narratives in, let's say, in opposition to each other. Can I have the next slide? And here are the implications. So for the dignitarian root narratives, climate change is an ideological issue. And for the egalitarians, it's a practical issue. The structural violence that's in the loops that reinforce this dependency and exclusion reduce local participation and enforce the hierarchies. So people are less likely to connect to each other, and the hierarchies are more likely to be in operation in terms of who gets positions, who has opportunities, etc. The polarization within the community across these Arctic communities likely are to increase as more leases are sold in the UNWAR. So as the oil drilling escalates, likely it's going to increase the polarization in the community. And that would be our assumption. And that the traditional practices of, Indigenous folks, they really mitigate lateral violence between people. But as these practices become less central through the increase of oil, largely, the oil industry, conflict resolution processes diminish, and resilience will probably be negatively impacted as the egalitarian. You would predict from this data that the egalitarian narrative is likely going to take root more so, and with less emphasis on the dignitarian. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, Kristin, we'll turn to you. Just a second.
Okay. It's going online.
I don't know how to. Do you know? Do you know how to? Yeah. Don't want to hide something.
Yeah. Perfect. That's great.
Is that okay? Right.
Yeah. Whatever. I have it on my own screen, so whatever is best for the audience is fine. So hi everyone. So building on the legal presentations with the Arctic Council pause and the to me obviously very fascinating Sarah's presentation on a much more theoretical base and kind of explaining the background. Now shifting gears to actually look at a case study, which is part of my PhD dissertation, specifically looking at Svalbard. Next slide. So to give kind of an overview of where this case study kind of falls in. My research focuses specifically on rapid Arctic changes and the impacts of that. So I tend to break this out into 3 buckets. There's the environmental impacts, so impacts of climate change. It's things like melting sea ice, storm surges, erosion, the introduction of invasive species, with a warming climate, ecosystem dynamics, things like that. Then related to that, particularly because of melting sea ice for the Arctic, there's a lot of development interest because now you can, there's increased access. So you can physically access places that were much harder to access before. And then with that, because there's easier access and more interest in development and arguably more development in general, there's kind of these geopolitical shifts that are happening. So for example, one anecdote, the US and Russia, even pre-Ukraine invasion, would have a collaborative relationship via with the US Coast Guard, and in terms of kind of non-security related but very necessary collaboration for activities in the Arctic, but that ceased as relations diminished. You also have things like non-Arctic nations taking a much greater interest. Of course, you have China coming in, but many other nations. There's a annual Arctic Arctic conference called the Arctic Circle Assembly that happens in Reykjavik, Iceland every year. And increasingly, I would say, especially over the last 10 years, you see very noticeable increased presence of countries like South Korea, many others. But South Korea definitely stands out in terms of having interests in kind of Arctic dynamics and the perceived potential benefits of both geopolitically being involved, and also then access to potential economic benefits of resource extraction and such. So for Svalbard, Svalbard has been directly impacted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion particularly, but also the partial invasion in 2014 before that. So if the next slide. So this is Svalbard. So Svalbard is essentially, it's essentially the last stop. Like if you're going to the North Pole, this is the last stop before you get to the North Pole. So it's an archipelago in the most northern section of the Arctic Ocean. It's essentially this is the main island here is called Spitsbergen, and if you see kind of in the middle, there's the town Longyearbyen, and that's the kind of default capital. That's the main hub. So you fly in and out of there. And then above that is Pyramiden, and below that is Barentsburg. And those are the two Russian settlements. And then the other ones are research hubs. They're just research stations. But Pyramiden and Barentsburg are Russian settlements. Longyearbyen is a Norwegian/international settlement. And how Svalbard works is after World War II, there's a Treaty of Svalbard was agreed upon between mainly Russia and Norway, and essentially there's a Norwegian side and the Russian settlement side, and but the whole of Svalbard is governed by the Kingdom of Norway, but it's a neutral zone, so anyone can live there. You don't need a permit, and so in Longyearbyen there's a big international community, and that's kind of the rough and tumble history of it. So the goal of this particular paper was to explore the emerging indicators of conflict related to these geopolitical tensions, namely the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that's relates to people living in Longyearbyen. And with that, to understand this relationship between indicators and the decision-making processes. Longyearbyen is also the administrative hub for Svalbard. So the Norwegian government representation is there. The governor of Svalbard is the Norwegian government's arm, a governance department. So there's an actual governor of Svalbard, but then it also refers to this entire big department of bureaucratic administrative activity. And then Longyearbyen itself also has its own community council, the Lokastira, and that's the local government function. So the study I used, I interviewed residents, did semi-structured interviews, which allows for kind of open-ended conversations, and then kind of coded inductively, so allowing for themes to emerge. So so this is kind of what I've already talked about, but here's kind of a map. So here's the North Pole, and here's Longyearbyen, and this is Svalbard here. So it's kind of you can see it's close to Russia and close to Norway. So the meat of the subject. So the key findings here are that the conflict indicators that I've identified are top-down decision making. So decisions are really made at the national level, heavily influenced by international dynamics, and then pushed down to the local community rather than the reverse. And that's a big change for the community. There's something called Norwegianization that's been happening as well. And essentially with shifting geopolitical dynamics, both increased interest from other new players in the field or non-Arctic participants, and also changing dynamics with Russia, then there's a reaction. There's been a reaction to that, or a perceived reaction to that, across many different policies to make Longyearbyen and Svalbard specifically more Norwegian, so, and less international, and less the perception then is, if it's more Norwegian, then it's less vulnerable to being manipulated by other actors. So that's resulted in, or you can see that through a lot of rapid policy changes. For example, about a little over a year ago, last March, the government in Oslo decided to change, to essentially stripped voting rights of local residents. If you, for the international community, so if you had not lived in Norway for 3 years prior to moving to Svalbard, then you used to have voting rights, but then you no longer had them. And there's been a lot of kind of similar policies trying to increase barriers to access the benefits and capacity to be able to continue living in Svalbard, trying to kind of change it into, the perception is among residents is that all these different policies that are happening are trying to change it into a more Norwegian, homogenous, or power-centric position. So these are kind of some of the impact on the local community. I'm happy to talk about more, but in the spirit of time, yeah, maybe we just leave it there. And so in terms of actually developing these indicators out, maybe one way to look at it. So these are the indicators, some of the indicators. So one that I find really fascinating is, yes, great, is the boycott, this fourth one down. So essentially what happened was with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, tourism is a primary livelihood. It's a major industry in Svalbard. And essentially in Longyearbyen, the businesses got together via Visit Svalbard, which is their collection. It's like a non-government organized the group for that a lot of the tour companies and tourism stakeholders belong to, and got together and voted to boycott the 2 Russian settlements, any kind of interaction, economic activity, no tours over there, no transportation over there, in terms of making it easier for tourism. There's still 2 boats that go, but yes, so there was a kind of a near universal boycott of the Russian settlements. The direct result of that was severed linkages to the Russian settlements, but also for community members. And the kind of mitigated or the more indirect consequences of that is obviously decreased tourism revenue to that side, to the residents there, and then also a lot of conflict, ethical dilemmas and conflicts among residents in Longyearbyen over that decision. Is that the right thing to do. You know, these are our neighbors. We live on an island where it's necessary to have these relationships where we really help each other out in times of need, and we've just cut these people off. Further complicating things is that at the time, a lot of the population for the Russian settlements were actually Ukrainian, because that's who was the population that was working there. And then there was a lot of migration from Russian settlements to Longyearbyen. And then the impact of all of this is that people's relationships with each other have been altered. Their relationship with place has altered. So a lot of residents used to go to the Russian settlements for a nice lunch or an overnight kind of getaway, you know, get out of the small town that you can feel a little confined in. But that now they kind of hesitate or don't feel safe doing it, or feel uncomfortable or feel judged doing that, and so stay away. And then of course then also this has also impacted livelihoods and people's ability to earn a living, both people on the Russian settlement side and the Norwegian side. So that's just as one example of many conflict indicators, and these are kind of the highlighted ones. So the conclusion for this is that you know, these identified indicators, they highlight both desirable and undesirable or unintended effects. So which was kind of an interesting thing. So kind of judgment-free zone. Obviously, you know, boycott has a lot of negatives to it, but there's also arguments to be made there that there's some positives as well. Multiple indicators overall point to an alienation among residents with that's having a direct impact on dynamics within the community, and also residents' interest and capacity to remain part of the community. There's a lot of discussion and comments on moving down to mainland, or, you know, things aren't the same here anymore. I don't know how much longer I'll stay, things like that. And then these indicators, the goal here is that they can be used inversely. So emerging conflicts in a community can also signal conflicts that are happening at national and international scales. So more than just saying, well, there's a war in Ukraine and that's impacting the local community, you can also look at the local community and potentially be able to identify these same indicators as indicators of kind of these larger trends, not rapid changes, and what that says about the higher scales. And in future research, hope to kind of map these linkages between you know, much more concretely between the decision-making process as detailed as possible and the impacts on the local community. So thank you very much, and any questions you might have.
Sara, and invite our panelists back.
So you can stop the recording now.
Okay.
For the